Okay, in today's lesson we're going to hopefully try and answer this question. What role does the operating system play? So in the last video that we created, we talked about what happens when we turn our computer on. And we talked about in the ROM, in the read-only memory, is a piece of software called the BIOS, which carries out a sequence of tests to test the different hardware components in our system. And we finished that video by talking about the fact that the BIOS then hands over control of the system to the operating system. Okay, so today we're going to explore a bit more, we're going to think a bit more about the operating system, and hopefully we're going to identify several different functions of the operating system. Now, you are all probably familiar with lots of different operating systems. So obviously the two main ones that you'll probably be familiar with would be Microsoft Windows. There are lots of different versions of Microsoft Windows. You probably have Microsoft Windows 10 on your computer at home, or maybe 7 or 8. There's also, if you've got a MacBook, you'll be using OS X. Okay, the Mac operating system, they're on version El Capitan. You might be using Linux, okay, which is a free operating system. That's an open source operating system. Hopefully in another video we'll talk more about what it means to be an open source operating system. You will probably also have used different operating systems on your phones. Okay, so you might have an Android phone, which uses the Android operating system, or you might have an iPhone, which means you'll be using iOS. Okay, so there's lots of different operating systems. There's lots of different examples of operating systems, and you use them every day. So for us as computer scientists, it's important for us to understand their function and the role that they play. So what we'll do is we'll continue on from where we left off in the last lesson. And so in the last lesson we talked about the BIOS and that sequence of tests that it performs. Okay, so once it's performed those sequence of tests, we then hand over control to the operating system. Now, you know from our first video about the insides, what we find on the inside of a computer, you know that our operating system is permanently stored in the hard disk drive. Okay, it can't be permanently stored anywhere else because the RAM only temporarily stores data. So when we turn our computer off, the RAM forgets everything that it ever knew. So to permanently store our operating system, we need to store it in the hard disk drive. Now, from our video in the last lesson, we learned that the hard disk drive is very, very slow. Okay, so although it permanently stores data for us, it's really, really slow. So if the CPU had to access instructions directly from the hard disk drive, the CPU would be sitting around, waiting around for instructions because the hard disk drive operates so slowly. Okay, so what the CPU wants to do ideally is it doesn't want to have to access the hard disk drive directly. So what it wants to do is it wants to access all the instructions and all the data it needs to run from the RAM. Okay, because the RAM is really quick. It's our Usain Bolt. It's very fast. So all of those instructions and all of that data, the CPU wants to access them from the RAM rather than the hard disk drive. So what does this mean when we hand over control to the operating system? Well, what that means is that the first thing the operating system needs to do is it needs to copy parts of itself from the hard disk drive, where it's been stored permanently, and it needs to copy those parts to the RAM. Okay, now why doesn't it copy the whole thing? Why does it only copy small parts of itself? Well, operating systems over the last 10 to 15 years have grown in size. Okay, I think the Windows operating system, last time I checked, took up about 10 to 15 gigabytes of space on your hard disk drive. All right, now you haven't got 10 to 15 gigabytes of RAM. You probably only got 4 or 8. If you're lucky, you might have 16 gigabytes of RAM. Okay, so we can't afford to copy the whole operating system from the hard disk drive to the RAM. We just copy the most important parts. Okay, so when we turn the computer on, there are certain parts that we require when we turn the computer on. So those important parts are going to get copied from the hard disk drive and they're going to get copied to the RAM. Okay, now once they're in the RAM, we can start interacting with our CPU, and our CPU can start executing some of those instructions so that our operating system can start doing some of its important functions. Okay, so the first function is probably the first interaction that you have with the operating system. So what's the first interaction that you have with the operating system? Well, it's the interface that it provides for you. Okay, so the operating system provides you with an interface, a way for you to interact with the hardware. So our operating system's first function is to act as an interface. Okay, now there are different types of interface, and we can take these for granted a little bit, but there are different types of interface. Now when I started computing maybe 20, 25 years ago, everything we did was done in the command line. Right? So that was called a command line interface. Now you're probably familiar with the command line if you go to the MS-DOS command prompt, or you can do the same thing in Mac OS. All right? So you've probably seen a command line interface, and it's just a flashing cursor. Okay. Now the thing about the command line interface, it works by you being required to know the commands. All right? So you need to know the commands to interact with the command line interface. Now, over the last 10 to 15 years, interfaces have been developed, and we no longer really use a command line interface. Instead, what you see and what you interact with is a graphical user interface, or a GUI. Okay, now what I want to explain to you are what some of the features that you see when you use a graphical user interface. Okay, now all of these features you'll be familiar with, but you probably just don't, you probably take them for granted and don't really see them. Okay, so what are the features of a GUI that we tend to expect when we see a GUI? Well, the things I kind of expect are, to start with, windows. Okay, so I would expect to see some windows. So that's one of the things I'd expect to see in my GUI. I'd also expect to see a pointer or pointers. Okay, so pointers are another thing I'd expect to see in a graphical user interface. We also tend to see menus. So we'll probably see menus, and of course we expect to see, when we see a graphical user interface, we expect to see icons. All right, so those are 4 features of a graphical user interface that I would expect to see in a graphical user interface. All right, now the graphical user interface makes it easier for you to interact with the operating system. All right, and that's what the job of that graphical user interface is, so you can interact with the operating system and do what you need to do. Okay, now so the first function is to act as an interface. Now there are lots more functions, and some of these functions you will see and some of them you won't see. So let's think about one of the functions that you do see that your operating system performs. All right. So one of the functions that it allows you to do is it allows you to multitask. So if you think what you do when you turn on your computer, I think about what I do when I turn on my computer. When I turn on my computer, obviously I'm running my operating system, and the first thing I tend to do is I open my emails. I also open up a browser window so I can check the news. Okay, I also tend to open up Skype just in case I want to communicate with anyone, and then I might start running applications, okay, like PowerPoint or Word, so I can do some work. I've probably also got NetBeans open so I can do some programming. So I will normally have between 8 and 10 different programs open at any one time. Okay, now the operating system creates the impression that those 8 to 10 applications are running all at the same time, that we can multitask, that we can do more than one thing at once. Okay, now I've got 8 to 10 applications open, but there's also lots of things happening in the background that the operating system is doing for me that I don't see. So actually there's lots of things all appearing to happen at once. Okay, but the clever thing, the clever function that the operating system does is actually those functions aren't all happening at the same time. And you know that. You know they can't all be happening at the same time because you haven't got a processor that allows you to carry out 10 or 12 or 20 things all at the same time. Okay? You've probably got a dual-core processor or a quad-core processor that, yes, would allow you to do 2 things at the same time or 4 things at the same time, but it won't allow you to do more than 2 or 4 things at the same time. But the operating system creates the impression that you can do lots of different things at the same time. Okay? And you know that it allows you to do that because, say you're in PowerPoint, you're making a presentation, you then swap. Okay, you've just received an email, so you swap between PowerPoint and your email. All right? Do you have to wait? Does it come up with the egg timer? Okay, or in Mac with the little spinning disk? Okay, no, it doesn't. It normally instantly moves between your email and your PowerPoint. So it creates the impression that those 2 run at the same time because you can flick between them without noticing that anything's actually happening. But actually in the background, what your operating system is doing for you is it's doing quite a complicated process of creating the impression that those two are running at the same time, but they're not. Okay, so a really important function that you can see your computer doing is it multitasking, allowing you to do lots of things at the same time. Okay, now for you to multitask, there are lots of things that the computer is doing in the background that you probably can't see. Okay, so one of the most important functions that it does is it manages your processor. Okay, now what is it that a lot of girls say about boys? They always say that boys can't do more than one thing at once. We can only think about one thing at once. All right, now if you think about your processor, if it was just doing one thing, if it just did one thing at once, if you just set it off and did a task, the problem with that would be that if you tried to do something else, you wouldn't be able to do because the processor would still be carrying out that task you set it to do. So for example, let's imagine that we want to render a video. So we press play and our video is rendering. Okay, now if the processor was only doing that task, if we then tried to browse the World Wide Web while that video was rendering, or we wanted to read our emails while that video was rendering, we wouldn't be able to because the CPU would just be doing that one thing. The processor would still be rendering that video. So actually what the operating system does for us is it does a little bit of video rendering, but then it stops that and then does something else, and then something else, and then something else. So create the impression that actually you can do lots of different things all at the same time. So the operating system is managing all of those jobs that the processor needs to do, and it's creating the impression that the computer is doing them all at once. But in fact, it's moving them, and the processor does a little bit of something, then a little bit of something else, and a little bit of something else, and it creates the impression that all of those jobs are happening at the same time. Okay? So the operating system is managing your processor, making sure it's optimizing its use. Okay? Now, the other thing that has to manage, again, you probably don't see this unless you go to Task Manager. Always worth going to Task Manager on your computer. Okay? So the other thing that your operating system is managing is the memory. Now, again, you must understand, you have not got an infinite amount of RAM. You haven't got an infinite amount of main memory. And yet one of the things that we understand is that our computer, our CPU, wants to run programs from here. It doesn't want to run programs from here. So if we want to run 8 or 10 programs, we've got to store those programs in here. Okay, not here, because this is too slow. So we've got to move them into this. Now the problem is, we've only got a finite amount of this. So we can't store all of the program in the RAM for the entire duration of it running. Okay, so what we've got to do instead is our operating system has got to manage that space, that amount of the storage in the RAM. Okay, and it's got to move things in and out constantly. While you're using the programs, it's moving data in and out of the RAM to make the most efficient use of that storage space. Okay, and actually one of the problems you can see, and you may have seen this before, if you run too many programs at the same time, your computer will end up stuck in a constant cycle of moving small chunks of data in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, and you'll get the flashing light, and you'll see your CPU doing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of flashing, and that's a real problem that your operating system can encounter. Okay, so processor management and memory management are really important parts of allowing your computer to allowing us to multitask. Okay, and that's a really important job of the operating system, is to create the impression that you are multitasking. Okay, now what else does the operating system do for us? Okay, well, it manages your files, so it does file management. Okay, so you see files and folders, but actually your hard disk drive is not organized in that way. Your hard disk drive is organized in a completely different way. But the operating system doesn't show you how the hard disk drive is organized because it would be too complicated for you to see the way that the hard disk drive is organized. So what the computer does instead, or what the operating system does instead, is it creates a view. You see files and folders, but actually those files and folders don't exist on your hard disk drive. The operating system is creating that view for you, that organized look of your hard disk drive. Okay, and that's part of the file management role. Let's just get rid of this. Okay, so now this one you can see, this function you can see. What happens when you plug a USB memory stick, or you plug a printer, or you plug a scanner into your computer? Okay, well normally it pops up and says, oh, we need to install the device. Okay, and you get the little window. And so the operating system is managing that device for you. It's installing the necessary drivers that it requires to communicate with those different devices that you've plugged into your computer. So one of the really important roles of your operating system is to manage your input and output devices and allow you to communicate with those input and output devices. So you can add anything into your computer system, and you should be able to communicate with it and operate it. Okay, so I/O management. So these are kind of the four main functions of your operating system: processor management, memory management, file management, and I/O management. Now, basic operating systems probably would just do those four functions. Okay, but as operating systems have developed, we've added in more functions that we normally would have included only in specialist operating systems. So now, unlike 20 years ago, we require all of our computers to be connected to a network because we all want access to the internet. So one of the other functions of our operating system is to allow us to network. Okay, so it provides us with all those networking functions so you can connect your computer to a network. And we'll talk about networking functions a bit more in a later video about networks. But one of the things that it allows us to do is it provides us with protocols, okay? Sets of rules that allow us to communicate with other people. What else does it allow us to do? Well, again, you can see this one. It provides you with security. Okay, so the operating system allows you to set up different users, okay, and you can give each one of those users a password, and so you can provide security in your system. You can also restrict access to different users to different parts of your system. So you can set up your system so that certain people can't install new pieces of software. So they're just normal users, or you can set up users that are administrators, which means they can install their own types of software. Okay, so the security function is another important function of an operating system. All right, so our question today was, what role does the operating system play? And hopefully here is a list of the different functions that the operating system plays. Okay, so it provides us with an interface, it allows us to multitask, it manages our processor, it manages memory, it manages our files, it manages our input-output devices, it allows us to do some networking, and it also provides us with security. So it does a huge role, okay, and there's a whole load of things that it allows us to do. The final thing I want to end on is something really important, and I think a really important feature of an operating system. Okay, now all of these things here, and we haven't really talked about them in detail, but all of these things here are complicated processes. It's actually a complicated process to understand how the operating system manages our processor, how it manages our memory, how it manages our files. So these are all complicated things that the operating system is doing for us. Okay, but it's doing complicated things, but it's making them look simple for us. Okay, so what we talk about is the fact that the operating system is acting as a virtual machine. Now, the idea of a virtual machine is that the operating system is taking complex processes, all right, and allowing us to do them, but really simply. So we can just go File and Save, and we can click Save, and our file is saved. Okay, but actually, the operating system is doing a whole load of complex things in the background. But all we need to do to save a file is go File and Save, and the operating system is doing all this hard stuff in the background, but we don't see any of that. Okay, so when we talk about an operating system acting as a virtual machine, we're saying that it hides all of this complicated stuff that it does, and makes it much easier for us to interact with our hardware and for us to use our computer systems. Okay, so hopefully I've answered that question, what role does the operating system play? And I will see you in our next video.